Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Fresno County Counts 2020. My name is John Dobard. I'm the Associate Director of the Political Voice Program at the Advancement Project California. And I'm joined by my colleague, Alejandra Ponce de Leon, who is a Policy and Research Analyst for the Political Voice Program. For those unfamiliar with our organization, Advancement Project California is a multiracial civil rights organization that works alongside community to achieve racial equity. We do that work primarily through policy advocacy on 4 issues. That includes education, public funding, health, and democracy. Our democracy work is housed in a program area that we call Political Voice, and that's the program area that Alejandra and I work in. Political Voice does work on 4 issues. One is public participation in governance, another is voting and election systems, a third is redistricting, and finally we do work on the census. With respect to the census, we do work on both the policy side and the field outreach side. On the policy side, we convene the Census Policy Advocacy Network, or CPAN, and you see our partners there on the screen. CPAN is a coalition of statewide organizations that are working to educate policymakers and community leaders about the government investment and sound policies needed to ensure a fair and accurate count in 2020. On the field outreach side, we are convening the Los Angeles Regional Census Table, which is a space for community-based organizations and other nonprofits to coordinate their outreach efforts, to share resources and knowledge, and also collaborate with local governments in the area, more specifically the county and city of Los Angeles. We are also conducting census webinars in multiple counties across the state, and today's webinar is part of that series. On your screen there, to ensure that community-based organizations and other nonprofits in Fresno County are informed about the 2020 census and motivated to lead outreach efforts in the region. We hope that by the end of the webinar, we all have a shared understanding of why the decennial census matters, some clarity on your region's hard to count populations, and finally a shared understanding of what your organization can do to ensure an accurate count in your county. To get there, you will hear from Alejandra and I, as well as from Jesus Martinez at CIVIC, or the Central Valley Immigrant Integration Collaborative, and from Ellen Braff Guajardo at the Sierra Health Foundation, about why this census matters, why Fresno County is at risk of an undercount, what's being done to mitigate that risk, and finally how your organization. We conclude at 4 o'clock. We will have see a few housekeeping items. Other than scheduled speakers, we ask that all web participants remain muted. During the Q&A portion of the webinar, please to the host, which is Political Voice. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for a few. This census matters. So the census matters. Another reason is that it's an opportunity to build community power. And organizations can do that by reaching out to community residents and building their base. They can also cross community missions of an outreach plan. Data are used. One way the data are used is to ensure protection of civil rights legislation. So if you think about the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, Equal Employment Opportunity Act, census data or census-derived data are used to enforce that type of legislation. Another important way that the data are used is to ensure equal and equitable political representation. So census data are used to reapportion seats in the House of Representatives. So seats in the House every 10 years lose seats based on, also used to redraw political districts from local to the federal level. So resort districts and others using census data. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, census data are used to guide the allocation of over $600 billion in federal funding to states and local communities to support services in health, education, transportation, housing, and more. In just the 16 largest census-guided federal programs, California receives over $76 billion annually, and that includes programs like Head Start, Early Head Start, Section 8 housing, Medicaid, and Medicare. All right, so there's a lot at stake, and in order for Fresno County to receive its fair share of political representation and federal funding in the decade after 2020, it's important that the Census Bureau accurately count all of the county's residents. However, three factors are converging that are going to make it difficult for the Bureau to do that. And those factors are the region's demographics and the state's demographics more generally, innovations in how the Census Bureau will administer the decennial census, and finally shifts in the federal landscape. So today I'm going to briefly touch on each one of these sets of risk factors, beginning with the last. So with respect to the last, over the last few years, there have been some shifts in the federal landscape that are really putting both California and Fresno County at risk of an undercount. These shifts include a chronic underfunding of the Census Bureau. So fiscal year 2018 was a good one for the Bureau in terms of funding, but there were several years prior to that where the Bureau did not receive the amount that it needed or the ramp up in funding that it's accustomed to, and therefore had to scale back some of the planning and preparations that it had intended to do. With 2019, we still don't have certainty on funding, so we could see further scale backs or shifts in preparations. Additionally, there has been a void in leadership. A permanent director, Stephen Dillingham, was sworn in as the permanent Census Bureau director last month. However, for a year and a half, the Bureau was without a permanent director, and therefore without a respected leader that could advocate for it in Congress and in the White House to ensure that the Bureau got what it needed. And we've seen what some of the effects of that have been. Additionally, on the policy side, we've seen shifts in federal immigration policy. So President Trump has issued executive orders, as I'm sure many of you know, that have made sweeping changes to the nation's immigration laws. This has led to a step up in enforcement or a step up in immigration enforcement. It's led to broadening the categories of undocumented immigrants that are prioritized for deportation. And we've seen these types of policy shifts generate fear in immigrant communities. Similarly, the Trump administration, President Trump, has issued executive orders banning entry for people from majority Muslim countries. We've also seen a general hostile stance toward the religion, which has also helped to generate fear in communities, in this instance, Muslim communities. These last two issues are particular, or should be of particular concern for Californians, given our demographics. We have the largest percentage of foreign-born residents at 27%, and we have a very large Muslim population in our state. So anything that's done that could generate fear in those communities and therefore dampen participation from folks in those communities has the chance to have a really adverse effect on our census population numbers. This risk is being exacerbated by a second set of factors, and those have to do with how the Census Bureau will administer the 2020 census. That census, the upcoming decennial census, will be unlike any in our country's history, and this largely has to do with what the Bureau is referring to as innovations. Following the 2010 census, Congress mandated that the Census Bureau conduct the 2020 census at a cost per household that does not exceed the cost of the 2010 census. To meet that mandate or comply with that mandate, the Census Bureau developed and has been in the process of trying to implement what it calls 4 innovations. You see those 4 innovations on your screen there. I just want to draw attention to 2. One is, you see up top there, new methods for updating the master address file. So the master address file is the file that the Bureau uses to contact households. If an address is not on that file, or a household address is not on that file, that household will not be contacted. And that's one way in which people get missed, or communities get undercounted. What the Bureau is doing for the 2020 census is, instead of having Census Bureau employees walk and physically check 11 million census blocks, they're going to be using GIS, or geographic information systems, administrative and third-party data, and other types of records to help with that update. Another innovation is one I'm sure many of you have heard about, and that is a shift to the internet as the primary mode of self-response. So this will be the first online census, and the Bureau will be relying on, as I mentioned, the internet as the primary mode of self-response, but not the only mode of self-response. So residents will still be able to respond via paper questionnaire and via telephone, but they will have, some communities will receive the paper questionnaire initially, others won't. Folks will have to call for that, but those will be options. An additional shift in the administration is one that I'm also sure folks have heard about, and that's the addition of a citizenship question to the 2020 census questionnaire. Last year, Secretary Wilbur Ross, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, directed the Census Bureau to add a question about citizenship to the 2020 census questionnaire. That question has not been asked of every household since 1950. Before and since Wilbur Ross's decision, there's been opposition to the addition of this type of question. Most notable at this moment is that there are 7 lawsuits against Wilbur Ross and the Commerce Department, urging the removal of this question. The most recent decision we've had on this litigation came last month. A district court judge, or a district judge in New York, ruled against the Trump administration and directed the Census Bureau to remove the question, or to halt their efforts to include the question on the 2020 census questionnaire. Again, given our state's demographics, something like this poses a significant risk to California. Again, we have the largest percentage of foreign-born residents. Something like this could help exacerbate fears and depress participation in the census, leading to an undercount of our population. We're happy, there's more to say. We're happy to talk more about this question during Q&A if folks have additional questions. The last set of factors that we want to draw attention to have to do with our demographics. And I've alluded to the importance of this, but I really want to emphasize this at this point, that our demographics are really the risk factor that is of utmost importance for us. It's the one that explains why the other 2 sets of factors are so important. California is the hardest to count state in the country, and that has to do with what are popularly known as hard to count populations, or HTC populations. The state of California recognizes 15 hard to count populations, but you'll see if you count on your screen, you'll see 16 there. And the reason for that is that we separate Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The state of California lumps those populations together. But these are the populations that the state recognizes. 2 populations that are generally considered hard to count but are not included in the state's list are low-income communities and renters. So more generally, those tend to be included, but they're not included here on this list. And we just want to make sure that folks know what HTC populations the state is looking at. So California is hard to count because we have a high concentration of these populations. And a hard to count population is, just generally speaking, a population that is less likely to self-respond or participate in the census. So we have a large number, a large concentration of these populations. And the issue is we have both diversity and large numbers. So if there's a hard to count population, California has it, and California has it in large numbers. CPAN estimates that a minimum of 19 million Californians are hard to count, and many of those Californians are in Fresno County. So Fresno County has a sizable share. So you see there, we estimate that Fresno County has a little over 600,000 hard to count folks. And we've broken that number down by race and ethnicity, so you can see that there. We've also broken that down by the number of folks who live in what are referred to as census tracts with high or very high low response scores, and those individuals who are hard to count but live outside of those census tracts. And we think it's important to make this distinction because we need to take a comprehensive approach. So the Census Bureau, or at least since the 2010 census, has used certain metrics to identify hard to count census geographies. In 2010, it used what was called the hard count metric, and that's largely where this term hard to count came from. The metric was based on an analysis of about a dozen variables. For the 2010 or the 2020 census, the Census Bureau is using what it calls the low response score, not the hard to count metric. So the low response score metric, or LRS metric. And the low response score refers to a score that census tracts or census geographies get that try to predict the level of households, the percentage of households that will not self-respond. So again, the LRS refers to the percentage of households in a census geography that will not self-respond. And this is helpful to the Bureau because then it helps the Bureau understand what geographies will require more outreach resources or media to generate a higher self-response rate. All right, so we've identified those folks that live in those census tracts that are considered by the Bureau to have high or very high low response scores, and then those that live outside of those census tracts. And to identify those that live outside of those census tracts, we worked with our partners to really identify key variables that could help explain lower likelihood of participation. So for Latinos, it's Latino non-citizens. For non-Hispanic whites, it's those living below the poverty line. For Asian Americans, it's those with limited English proficiency. For Blacks and African Americans, it's those living below the poverty line. For Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, what you see there is the total population, but broken into those living in hard to count census tracts and those living outside of them. In those two instances, because the populations are relatively small and just generally hard to count, we didn't think it made any sense to try to identify one or a few variables to identify folks living outside of hard to count census geographies. So happy to talk more about this during Q&A, but this gives you a sense of the scale of the hard to count problem in Fresno County. Now, what explains the hard to count is there are various reasons that explain why particular populations are less likely to participate in the census, but most of those boil down to barriers. And we know what some of the common barriers are. They include uncertainty about the purpose and use of the census or of census data. So there are a lot of folks who just don't know that the census is taken every 10 years and don't know why it's important or how census data are used and how that impacts their lives. There's uncertainty about who should be included, and this is often how children get missed. Parents don't know that they should include their newborn. It's not just a count of adults. Fear and mistrust of government are some common barriers, and limited English proficiency. So the challenge for folks in Fresno County is to help a minimum of 600,000 residents overcome these and other barriers to participate in the census and ensure that those folks get the representation and the funding that they deserve. To help us have a clearer sense or a more detailed sense of where those folks are, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alejandra.
Cool, thank you, John. So now we're going to dive in deeper in Fresno County's hard-to-count population. And so we conducted a data analysis of the hotspots, basically the census tracts that are scoring very high on the LRS, meaning the low response score. So we looked at census tracts that measured 30 and above. And we utilized this using the Census Bureau Response Outreach Area Mapper, or ROAM. I included here on the slide the link for folks to check it out if you haven't done so already. And so basically we went onto this this website and actually checked out, the percentage of households that are predicted not to self-respond to the census. And for our analysis, we really focused on those that were scoring 30 and above. And so these census tracts, the measurement is really, it's based on 26 variables. So either like age or poverty level, race and ethnicity. And basically this is just capturing the hard to count populations by geography. So we went ahead and did that, and part of our analysis was really about looking at those very high LRS score census tracts. And so we looked at these, and then we narrowed our analysis to the top 25. The top 25 census tracts, either by LRS or other demographics that we were looking at, such as race, ethnicity. We were also looking at poverty, children 0 to 5, median household income, renter-occupied households, English proficiency, and foreign-born. So our analysis of these top 25 census tracts for each of these demographics was done both by percentage and the raw numbers. And so all of this information, we are going to be providing it after the webinar in an email, so you'll all have handouts with all the detailed information. So today I'm only going to show you snapshots of this analysis for you. And so here we are looking at, an image of Fresno County, a section of it. And so when you go on to the ROAM website, you are able to see this type of image, right? And so as you can see here, the census tracts are, they have different colors. And so we only focused on those that are very high, meaning those that are dark blue. But you can also see the range, on here of the different colors. And so the lighter, the lighter the spectrum, the lower the score it is for the LRS. And so this is just to give you a sense of like what you would look at. And the idea that I wanted, to see for folks to have snapshots of these different parts of Fresno County is just to get a sense of, where the hotspots are, where is the concentration of those that are very hard to count. And really for folks to think about, even where you're located, where is your organization, your institution based, where are the communities that you're actually reaching into and working in, to kind of see where the overlap is with these census tracts that are very high on the LRS. Again, I think that, what we had talked about earlier, John had mentioned that, it's really about, building power. And so the census also provides an opportunity for folks to look, as a way of like, how do you expand, your base building, your movement efforts, right? So if there are areas that you have not been able to, expand into, sometimes like actually the census provide that opportunity to really reach into other communities and other folks that, are not part of your organization. So just wanted folks to kind of see, the different places where those concentrations are of the very high LRS scores. So here's another area of the county. So within these very high LRS census tracts, we wanted to capture, just the information of like what the breakdown is by city, and by city and in unincorporated areas in Fresno. And so as you can see here, you'll see the breakdown, like how many, census tracts that are very high on the LRS correspond to each of these different areas. And what really stands out is that the city of Fresno has the highest number of LRS census tracts on there. So you can see this, and this is just to kind of give a sense for folks, just the breakdown of the very high LRS census tracts. The next chart here just shows you just the population estimates within these very high census tracts. So within these, we're talking about a total of over 262,000 residents that are in these tracts. And so this is just to give you a sense, in terms of like the scale. And again, this is just the very high census tracts. The next level are the high, ranking, high scoring census tracts. And so that's another layer of numbers as well. But this is just to give a sense for folks, how many within these very high LRS census tracts, are below poverty, how many of them are Black, African American, American Indian, Pacific Islander, foreign born, and so forth. So now what I want to kind of share with you is also our analysis, the top 10 census tracts. Here we see the top 10 census tracts that are based on LRS scores. So the area on track 7802, which covers the area of 5 Points in Huron, is an area that's actually scoring the highest on the LRS. So this is just to give you a sense, just kind of like the breakdown of where are the census tracts that have the highest LRS score. And this is just to really help, when it comes to census outreach and thinking about the resources that, your organization or collectives have, to outreach, thinking about, what areas you would want to prioritize. We would really emphasize thinking about those that are scoring very high on the LRS. The next set of top 10 census tracts is broken down by demographic, by race and ethnicity. For today, we're only showing for this webinar just due to time constraints by race and ethnicity, but we do have other indicators such as poverty level, age, household median income, and so forth that will be provided as part of the handouts that we will be sharing later on from the webinar through email. And so for this one here, for the Latino community, we see here track 8301, which is the area that covers the unincorporated areas of Benito, Cromer, and Arbios. And so this area has 98% percentage, 98% of its population is Latino. And you can also see just, the rest of the areas that, have a very high percentage of Latinos as well. The next one is the top 10 for the Black African American community. And here we see that in Fresno, the city of Fresno, we have census tract number 10, and also number 7 are tied actually as number 1. So number 10, track number 10 is around the West Fresno Elementary and middle school, so that area. And then for track number 7, that's around the Fresno Chandler downtown airport area, just to give you a sense of where the concentration is with the highest percentage of the Black African American community. The next one is the top 10 for the Asian American population. And so here we see that in the area of Las Palmas, Cameo, unincorporated areas in track 30.01, which is just south of the Fresno Yosemite Airport International. So that area has the biggest concentration percentage-wise for Asian Americans. Again, we're going to be providing all of this information with more detail, especially geographic detail of where these census tracts are located as handouts, so bear with me. But here we have the top 10 for the American Indian, Alaska Native. And so in this one, the number 1 is in tract 5.01 in the city of Fresno, and that's around the Holmes Playground, just along the 41 freeway north of Ventura Avenue. So this is the area where you have one of the areas that has the highest concentration, and it's tied with other areas of the city. So also in Fresno, for this population, tract number 1, that's around the Fresno Superior Court. The next one, 38.05, that's west of the Fresno area, south of Muscatel. And then track 34, that's east of the 41 freeway, southeast of Manchester Shopping Center. So those 4 were tied as number 1 for this population as well. And lastly, we have top 10 census tracts for Pacific Islanders. And so here, just a big jump in the area in the city of Fresno with track 9.02, and that's just the southern area of Fresno. And so that one has 14% of the Pacific Islander population there. Well, it has 14% percentage of the Pacific Islander in that district, or in that census tract. Moving on, so I wanted to kind of switch gears here. So I got just cover the top 10. Again, in your packets, you will see more of the top 25 actually for each of these racial groups, racial and ethnic groups, as well as other demographics. But here, I wanted to switch gears to talk about key census tracts. And I really wanted to highlight 3 census tracts just as a sample. In terms of just elevating, that within one census tract, there is a concentration of not just one, demographic, but various demographics in one area. And so here for tract 7802, it's in the area of 5 Points Huron. And so here you actually see that in this tract by itself, it's kind of highlighted in blue on the borders. It's a little bit hard to tell, but here it was number 1 for the LRS score, as well as number 1 as the lowest household income. It's also number 3 for foreign-born percentage-wise, and it's also number 3 for households that nobody speaks, above the age of 14 speaks English very well. And so here you have just the representation of the different types of demographics of the demographics that make up the hard-to-count population, and just the combination and the concentration in just one census tract. Another key census tract is 1407, which is in the area of Gold Leaf, and that's just southeast of the Eastgate Shopping Center. And so this area right here, it's number 1 for Black African-American population, just in raw numbers. It's also number 2 on the LRS score, and it's also number 2 for lowest household income. So you see here also just the diversity of the different hard-to-count populations here, and just where it's ranking on the top 25. And then lastly, we have tract 902, which is south area of Fresno. And this area here is actually number 1, both percentage-wise and raw numbers for Pacific Islander population, and also for renter-occupied percentage-wise. It's also number 2 for the population below poverty percentage-wise as well. And you also see just the other demographics here as well. And so this is information that we really wanted to uplift for a lot of folks that are planning to do census outreach, and thinking about just the different areas, and just uplifting some of these census tracts that have concentrations in such diversity of demographics within them as well. And so right now we just shared with all of you some of the challenges, right, when it comes to, with the census outreach. Both John and I, we talked about the barriers, we've gone in depth, or as much in depth here in terms of the data. But this is really just to set the context and the understanding of just, the amount of effort and collaboration that is needed in your region to be able to tackle this and to ensure a complete count. But I don't want to leave you all feeling, like, oh my gosh, this is hopeless, this is so hard. But, rather, I want to shift gears and actually pass it over to Jesus and Ellen to talk more about, the efforts that are happening at the state level, but also locally to ensure that there is a complete count. So pass it over to both of you.
Thank you, Alejandra and John. This is Jesus Martinez. I'd like to thank you once again for the invitation to be part of this webinar and to share some of the information that is relevant to the work that we're doing in the Central Valley. Alejandra, next please. A little bit about Civic, and I'm going to be going very rapidly through the first few slides because they're just background material, and then I'll be concentrating for the most part on 2 slides. So Civic, the Central Valley Immigrant Integration Collaborative, is based in Fresno. Most of our partner organizations are also from the Fresno County and Fresno City area. It was established in 2014 to try to improve conditions for immigrants in the Central Valley. So we organize a lot of different things, particularly legal services workshops all over the Central Valley, but Fresno is our base. Next, please. So in this work that we've done throughout the Central Valley, there are several things that we have learned, because when we began our work in 2014, we ran into some very interesting data at that point in time. There's supposedly some 900,000 immigrants in the region that we try to serve, which extends from Kern County to Stockton over in Joaquin County. And when we were created Civic, at that point in time, there were only about 8 or 9 accredited representatives that were able to provide legal services through a non-profit organization. So 8 or 9 people to serve 900,000 immigrants gives you an idea of the lack of infrastructure that existed. That was the reason why we decided to create a regional collaborative that will be able to help and bring together organizations willing to support immigrants. So we learned several things along this way. Next, please. One of those issues, of course, is the immigrants themselves, as was pointed out in the presentations by John and also Alejandra. Immigrants constitute a hard-to-count community or communities. And in this entire region, in addition to the 900,000 immigrants, there are approximately 500,000 children with at least one immigrant parent. So we're talking about a population of at least 1.5 million. And this is based on, obviously, 2010 census data with different estimates, but that was a broad number that was utilized. Next, please. We also learned that in order to maximize the impact, it's necessary and also possible to have regional coordination and collaboration to be able to serve a hard-to-serve population, at least in the case of immigration. So this regional collaboration that has taken place has enabled us to organize easily over 300 legal services workshops, plus hundreds of informational events throughout the entire Central Valley since 2014 to the present. So that's a really huge number of events that would not have been possible without the support of many different organizations all over the Central Valley. Next, please. So with respect to the census, we began to work in the census a little bit over a year ago, becoming involved in a research project as an entity to try to identify neighborhoods in the Fresno area that included housing units that were not being included in the master address file. That was part of the LUCA project that John also mentioned in his presentation. But we began to become more actively involved in a broader range of issues, beginning in the late spring, early summer of last year, after the state of California organized in Fresno a regional census meeting that was part of a series of meetings held throughout the state of California. About 25 were held throughout the state. And at that moment, we began to realize several things. One of those very important issues was that after the state of California organized this meeting in Fresno, and it held also some other ones in Kern County and also in Modesto, there was no follow-up work or attempt to bring together those organizations that had met in the month of May. So civic and partner organizations began to identify a number of things to do to be able to strengthen the regional work dealing with the 2020 census. So one of those, and you have here the 5 major components of the strategy that we have developed. One is to try to bring together organizations to create local level coalitions focused on the census and or complete count committees. A second major objective was to try to contribute to their organizational capacity building, because part of what we're seeing throughout the Central Valley was that organizations were not at that point in time really fully aware of what the 2020 census was about, and only a few of them had a history of previous engagement in the census. And even some of those that had already participated in the census, they no longer had the staff members that had been involved in the 2010 or 2000 census. There were only a few that still maintained some staff members and some institutional memory. So developing organizational capacity was very important. We organized a series of training opportunities for them. And also, number 3, to be able to organize the region as a whole and to be able to contribute through the efforts of these different local groups, a regional perspective and a regional coordination of efforts, just like we're doing with immigration. And the other 2 points, one, to become involved in different census research projects. Ellen's going to be talking more at length at those. And the 5th one, to become involved in advocacy related to census at the state and also the federal level. So the next slide, please. So at this stage, after becoming involved in a number over several months in census-related activities, we still find that several things are needed. One is to continue to involve more institutions, community-based organizations, local governments, and the private sector in census-related activities. We're still in the beginning of this process. There's a year left, but we still need to do a lot of work. Secondly, we also need to become involved in the dissemination of current and future census employment opportunities, both at the federal level with the Census Bureau and also at the state level with the state of California. And third, we also need to do a better job of coordinating the incipient efforts dealing with regional communication and coordination. So that is still a part of the process that needs to be taking place. Next slide, please. So this process is just getting started. Next slide. We have a year left, and what the message that I want to communicate, which is the major one that we've been trying to communicate all over the place, so there is a need for more engagement from everyone, whether you're a community-based organization, local level official, or even from the private sector. Next, please. Some key resources, in addition to what John and Alejandra may be sharing, there are some websites and my contact information on the last slide. And I will turn it over to Ellen. And you have to unmute yourself, Ellen.
Okay, I think I did it. Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for this opportunity. This is Ellen Braff Guajardo. I can see from the sign-ins that I know many of you, and it's great to have this opportunity to share some information about the San Joaquin Valley Census Cluster Project. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund, I think many of you may know about, is a project of the center at the Sierra Health Foundation. I'm a senior program officer with the Sierra Health Foundation and the center. The center is the 501c3 of the foundation. And the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund is a collaborative project of the center. I say collaborative because it's a project that includes nearly 100 nonprofits from the San Joaquin Valley, from Kern County in the south to San Joaquin County in the north, and 18 different funders, both national and state funders. And within the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund, we have a particular project around the census, and that is supported by 8 funders. Now, at the bottom of this slide, and I assume these slides will be available to the whole group, is the site where you can find and easily access the reports that I'll be talking about that come out of the recent census research here in the San Joaquin Valley. Next slide, please. Thanks. So since 2018, the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund has been able to bring in nearly $900,000 from those 8 different funders for census-related activities. During phase 1, which was 2018, we supported that address canvassing. We were one of the funders that were able to support the address canvassing that Jesus mentioned. We also sponsored a number of activities to both build capacity and awareness around the census and the importance of the census here in the San Joaquin Valley. And most notably, we funded California Institute for Rural Studies as the research lead for census-specific research here in the San Joaquin Valley. And Dr. Cindy Quesada, who works with Civic, was the research manager on the ground here in the Valley for that research, and then she continues in that role. This year, in 2019, we've begun to publish those research reports, and I just really want to emphasize the importance and relevance of the reports. There are a total of 6 reports that are in various stages of getting ready for online publishing. 2 of the reports and their executive summaries are on the San Joaquin Valley San Joaquin Valley Health Fund site, and I encourage everyone on this webinar to take a look at those reports. They are very helpful when you're thinking about both outreach and messaging here in the San Joaquin Valley. They are quite specific. And while, you know, John, I think you did a terrific job of talking about, you know, many of the barriers, the reports really dig deep about how those barriers and challenges impact different groups and different subgroups of hard to count here in the San Joaquin Valley. In addition to publishing the research reports, this year we continue in activities related to capacity building, and we're also supporting advocacy through the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund. We recently made 10 grants to San Joaquin Valley nonprofits for local and regional census advocacy. I see many of those grant recipients are on the webinar, and that's great. We also helped coordinate an effort for the filing of a friend of the court brief, or an amicus curiae brief, in the litigation in one of those 7 lawsuits that John mentioned, opposing the citizenship question. And that particular amicus brief was filed in the lawsuit that was brought by the Attorney General's Office of the State of California. I'm really pleased to say that there were 18 organizations that co-signed that amicus brief, including 6 funders, Sierra Health Foundation, the California Endowment, Blue Shields of California Foundation, California Wellness, and others, as well as, you know, many organizations from here in the Valley. So that's wonderful. It really shows that, you know, this is an important issue. The implications of the citizenship question, as you'll see when you look at the research, are quite staggering here in the Valley, and for what it means for ensuring that we have a complete count of the hard to count. And we continue this year with work around strategic engagement, advocacy work, you know, education and outreach, and really developing those and working with those partnerships, as Jesus mentioned. And of course, phase 3 will be both, you know, the get out the count, but also post-census. And as John mentioned, you know, there is considerable concern that we may wind up with a failed census if all of us, all the folks on this webinar, and, you know, lots of other organizations, agencies, and partners don't really work together to ensure a complete count. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I just really quickly wanted to mention again some of the findings, or the relevancy of the findings from those first 2 published reports on the San Joaquin Valley research. And these 2 reports are specific to the Latino cohort. Their additional reports include research results from the other major racial and ethnic groups in the Valley. But the Latino cohort is the largest and most likely the most significant in terms of the impact of the citizenship question. And so the research team wanted to be sure that those findings were published in time to be considered by the courts in the litigation against the citizenship question. And so in addition to one-on-one interviews with, in this case, 414 Latinos who were both first and second generation immigrants, there are also insights from various focus groups. For the Latino cohort, the ones that are currently reported are from indigenous immigrants, DACA recipients, and second-generation young adults. And what we see is what the pattern of response is likely to be for the census, depending on whether or not the citizenship question remains. And as I mentioned earlier, there really are strategic implications for messaging. And it's not just messaging between cohorts like Latino versus Hmong, but it's also messaging within cohorts, within subsets. There really are, what the research is showing is that there really is a different kind of message that will resonate with a DACA recipient versus a legal permanent resident versus a citizen. There is also quite a bit of research findings related to those structural barriers to census participation that John mentioned. And finally, there are projections of the undercount of Latino immigrants and the aggregate undercount in the San Joaquin Valley. So I just can't stress enough the importance for all of you on the phone who are interested in ensuring a complete count and really taking a look at this research and thinking about its implications for your messaging and outreach. Next slide, please. Thanks. And here's just one key finding from the research, and that is the dramatic reduction in the willingness to respond to the census if the citizenship question is included. And so for undocumented Latinos, 80% of those surveyed, and again, these were face-to-face personal interviews, 80% said, yeah, they would respond to the census. But when the citizenship question was explained, that there was a citizenship question, if there was, that 80% response rate dropped to 25%. And you can go down, and what's really interesting is sometimes in the media you hear that, oh, well, it's just the undocs who aren't going to respond if there's a citizenship question. But even US-born second-generation Latinos who would 89% reported they would be willing to complete the census once they were asked about or informed about the fact that there was a citizenship question on it. That willingness to respond dropped to 49%. So that is why, it's one of the reasons why it's so important that we all work to try to get that citizenship question eliminated from the census. Frankly, though, in some respects, the damage has been done. And some folks we all have quite a challenge to get folks to respond, whether the citizenship question is there or not. Next slide, please. So again, the full reports are on the San Joaquin Valley site. And also on this slide, you have both my contact information as well as Ed Kassam, who is one of the co-funders of the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund Census Cluster Project, but is also the lead author and census researcher on these two reports, as well as Cindy Quesada, who again is with Civic, has done a tremendous job as an on-the-ground manager for the census research. So with that, I will pass it back to Alejandra. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Perfect. Thank you, Jesus and Ellen. So wanted to open it up. I've gotten a few questions that have been sent through the chat. If you have questions, please chat them over to me. Two questions that I have here is related to just the data. And so questions about is this data available disaggregated, among the Asian American population? So meaning broken down by Cambodian, Hmong, and other residents. And then there was another question in relation to, like, is the data available, breaking the intersectionalities of the demographics, like, for example, they gave, like, no one speaks English well, plus, is Asian American. And so for the first question, for that one right now, we don't have the disaggregated data of, like, for the Asian American population broken down by all the different ethnicities, so Cambodian nationalities. That's not provided on the Rome census data. It's all lumped together. What is provided, and that's something that I will be included as part of the handouts, as at least the language. And so you'll see the breakdown percentage-wise of certain demographics. So if they are foreign-born, I will share with you, what at least is the percentage of the languages spoken for that as like a proxy. And so that's like the only thing that is available. John, I don't know if you happen to know if there's any other disaggregated data from the Census Bureau. And then the other question is, like, will there be data showing just the intersectionalities? At the moment, we're only kind of putting together data just like by the different racial ethnic groups, and then also, by isolated demographics. So we haven't done that other layer of analysis of like looking at the intersectionalities. And so we won't have that available for the moment, at least for this project. But definitely, like, if you wanted to chat with us and get ideas in terms of like how you can get access or how to look into that, we're more than welcome to have a conversation, whoever asked. So you have my contact information there on the slide. But there was one other question that came up in terms of just elaborating a little bit more by what do we mean by tracts. So John, if you want to take that, you can speak through my mic.
Yeah, so tracts refer, the Census Bureau organizes the country by certain types of geographies, and those are census tracts, census block groups, and census blocks. The largest geography is a tract that comprises census blocks, and then census block groups, and then census block groups comprise census blocks. Each tract has around 1,500 to 8,000 people in a tract, and so that just breaks down by census block group and census block. So a tract just refers to a way in which the Census Bureau divides up the country and then administers the census. So when we start getting response rates, the Census Bureau will report those out by census tract. So as organizations are doing their outreach, we believe on a weekly basis we should be able to get response rates by census tract, and so you will be able to see where the response rates are by week, and you should be able to then determine whether or not you want to adjust your outreach based on those response rates. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, John. Going back in terms of the question on like the languages, so the languages that we will be providing is also what was available on the Rome data. So the languages consist of Chinese, Korean, Tagalog, Russian, Spanish, and Arabic are the ones that are there. Ellen, there is a question for you in regards to the reports. Is there a way to subscribe to these reports, or do they just check the San Joaquin Valley Census website periodically?
Pardon me, I didn't hear the question. Is there a way to subscribe, did you ask?
Yes, to have access.
Yeah, so if for folks who are have ever been funded under the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund, as I mentioned, that's about 100 organizations. There is a weekly e-blast that is shared with them, and notice of the census reports are there. But otherwise, yeah, you'll have to just check the website. We do expect the third report will be out in the next week or week and a half. The research team is working really hard to get that one out, because there may be further opportunity to file amicus briefs. And we know that that report, which includes more reflections from both the narrative answers that surveyed individuals offered, as well as narrative from the focus groups, will serve as the basis of that report, and we think it will be very relevant to the litigation. So please do check the website now for the reports that are up there, the 2 reports plus the 2 executive summaries. And I would say check, next week for the 3rd report.
Thank you, Ellen. So I want to be mindful of the time. We're about up, and so there's a couple of questions that are left. And so next steps is that we will respond to these questions as part of the email that I will be sending out to everybody with all the handouts, including a copy of this, the PowerPoint and the recording of it as well. And so we will respond to the questions that were still kind of left on the chat. But I want to thank all of our speakers, Jesus and Ellen, for being here, and all of you for making some time today, this afternoon, to join us as well. And so thank you again. And so if anything, please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any further questions, and then we will be following up shortly soon after this webinar with an email with all the materials and information as well. Thank you all, and have a good day.